and welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to start with a brand new starter project. And in this case, the starter project is called Pizza Times. Of course, it is about food as usual. And what you can do to get started if you are working along is you can scroll down into the video description down below. You're going to see a link to download the starter solution. And if you click on that link, you will get a zip file. And if you unzip that file, it'll create a folder wherever you unzip that will have a name like Pizza Times. You can rename the folder if you want to, but you're going to go into your terminal and change into that folder just like I've done on my machine here. And the first thing I like you to do is go ahead and run npm install to install our Parcel dependencies for our Parcel solution that we're going to be building with, just like the last taco spinner solution that we built and worked on in the last previous lessons. And you can see here our dependencies have been installed. I can run code dot to open this up in Visual Studio Code, and we can have a look at the starter solution and what it looks like. It's an extremely similar setup to what you saw in the taco spinner, the previous exercise and example that we worked on. So there's some configuration files here, but most importantly, you have your source or SRC folder, which contains an index.html. Again, a very similar setup to what we had before. We are linking a couple style sheets in here. You can notice there's sass/app.sass. So if we open up app.sass, you'll see that file, starter file is right here. The only starter styles that we put in here were basically just to style up so we don't have an ugly application to begin with. Some stories that are within the app HTML itself. So you'll notice there's like a story and a thumbnail style, and you can look through these if you want, but they're basically just there to style up some of the HTML content that we have right down here. And so the idea of this app, this Pizza Times, is it's like a newspaper that's all about pizza. And so they have these stories, or like a news feed, if you will, that talks about pizza. And so we'll see what this looks like in just a moment. You can sort of look through the HTML here to see we basically just have two stories. There's some comments here, story 1 and story 2. And then finally, all the way at the bottom, just as before, we are loading in js/app.js, which is an empty file to begin with. So nothing at all in the JavaScript, it's basically just some HTML and CSS to get started. And in the terminal, if you go ahead and run npm run start, you can start up your local Parcel dev server in your default browser, and you can take a look at what this solution looks like. And you can see here, I've opened the solution up. This is what it looks like when we're running our local dev server. We have our story feed, if you will, sort of showing up inside of this app. There's a whole bunch of buttons that currently don't do a thing if you click on them. So we're going to wire those up here in a moment. But basically, it's just, again, you can think of it as like this feed of stories, a very simple web application. But of course, we have our HTML and our CSS and all the good stuff that we're going to work with as we start to implement some web interaction components into this application that we are building. So the first task, and what I want to do in this lesson, is to kind of use the same pattern we use with our switch button in previous lessons. But this time we're going to introduce the idea of having multiple HTML elements in play. And specifically, what I would like to do is, you'll notice underneath each story, there is this plus button right here. And then you have these what you could call reactions to the story. So you could like the story, you could love it, you could dislike it. But the idea is the plus button will actually control the visibility of these other buttons. So it's kind of like a switch in that you're turning something on and off. But this time around, we're going to have sort of a trigger button. So that's going to be the plus button over here. And then we're going to have a target for that particular action. So you're going to click here, and the target will actually be toggled as opposed to just toggling the button, the trigger button itself. So it is going to be a little bit different, but you will notice a lot of similarity as we start to implement this into this solution. And it's going to be a good exercise because it's going to serve as the basis for all sorts of common web interactions, things like dialogues and or modals rather, and drop-down menus, and just all kinds of stuff. Use this sort of pattern of having a trigger button and then some sort of target where you do stuff to the target. So let's go ahead and implement this now. We will jump into Visual Studio Code. And first of all, let's go into our app.js file. Again, it's an empty file to start. And what I'd like to do is, just like we did with our switch, is I want to create a separate file in our JS folder. So we're going to right click and go to New File. And this time we can call this very generically and very simply a toggle. So again, the plus button is going to toggle the display of the reaction buttons to the right. So we'll just call this toggle.js, and just as we did with our switch, we're going to export a class, but we'll call it toggle in this case. And just as before, we're going to create a new toggle instance, and that will be a constructor that's going to accept some options, and we will configure the component just as we did before, and we'll say this.config is equal to object.assign. And then we can set our options or whatever in here that we decide to do, and then comma options. And again, this is going to be the default configuration for this toggle component. So I think what I'd like to do in this case is I want to use, very similarly to what we did with a switch, where we had an attribute selector that actually allows this to function off of HTML elements. And we can kind of use that as the hook to check if we're clicking on a toggle button, if you will. So we're going to do sort of the same thing we did with the switch, where we're going to set an ATTR attribute option in our configuration for this component, and we'll just call this data toggle by default. And then we'll also want to make sure we implement some lifecycle methods. So we could do like an on toggle that'll do just like we did before with the switch. We had that on switch lifecycle method. In this case, we'll do button and is toggled, and that will just return an empty function by default. So very, very similar to what we had before. Nothing special, nothing new here. We will also initialize the component. So this.init, and we'll create that method in just a moment, and then we will return this just as we did before. So that's our constructor. That's almost identical to the switch that we had before. So hopefully nothing new there, but it's good practice to kind of go through this process and set this stuff up. So let's go ahead and initialize the component with an init or initialize method. And then we'll add our click listener here, document.add event listener click. And then we'll do the thing where we capture the click event or the mouse event that actually occurs, and we'll pass that off to a custom method we create on this class called this.toggle, like so. And then we will, down here, we'll create that toggle method. And again, I want to get some IntelliSense on this E object, which is, by default, the linter doesn't know what that is. So you're not going to get, like when you try to go E.target, you don't get any nice IntelliSense there or anything. But if we add a JS.doc comment, so / tab, it'll kind of expand out the parameters of this method. And I can say this is actually a mouse event, or click event, and then we'll give this a comment of toggle a target element. And now when I type E dot, you'll see I get lots of nice IntelliSense, E dot prevent default, E dot target, and all that good stuff because I have typed our parameter up here. Sort of like when you're using TypeScript. I personally like TypeScript, and I kind of miss it when I'm writing pure JavaScript, but you can kind of get some of those same benefits using these JS.doc things. And within our toggle method, just as before, we will check to see if we are not a toggle button, because this is a global click listener. So we want to immediately return out of this method if it's a click we don't care about. And to do that, we'll do if e.target.matches. And again, we put the exclamation point there. So we're saying if it does not match, then return. And we're going to do a template string here. And just as before, we'll basically put data toggle and data toggle space asterisk to allow click targets that are either the data toggle button itself or some child element of the data toggle button. But of course, this attribute is configurable, right? Because we made it configurable up here in our options. So just as before, I'm going to replace both of these instances with a JavaScript template string expression, which will be this.config.attr, like so. And if that returns a truthy thing, then we will simply return out of this method. And before I get too much further, I just want to make a point of clarity, because when I was kind of coming up with this course and trying to think about what I should call things, I wrestled with the idea of using the term target to describe like when you click on this, it's going to toggle a target element. But that's a little bit confusing, right? Because you also have e.target or the mouse event target, which is a target as well. So I don't want to like confuse you guys by like kind of using that term target back and forth. So what I'm going to try to do, I will try my best to do this, is every time I refer to a click target, meaning it's like the mouse event target or e.target that comes from a mouse event that you're capturing in a listener, I will try to call that event.target, e.target, or I will call it a click target. So that's going to be kind of the terminology I use to refer to this sort of target, which again is the target that the listener actually returns saying, this is what you clicked on with the mouse. Whenever I refer to a toggle target, or like when you click on this plus button, we want to toggle its target HTML element, I will try to refer to that as either a toggle target or a target element, just to kind of keep things nice and clear. So just a point of clarity there. Hopefully you guys follow. Hopefully I don't confuse you too much on that point. But honestly, I couldn't think of a better term to call it other than target. Like that's just, even in like Bootstrap and other popular front-end frameworks, whenever they refer to like when you have a drop-down, you have a trigger button and you have a target. And the target is usually like a menu that drops down. And that's just kind of, that's the naming convention we use across the board in the front end world. So I didn't want to deviate from that too much. And so unfortunately, there's a little bit of ambiguity here when we use the term target, but I'll just try to make that really clear when we're talking about that and going through this. Okay, so what happens when we get to this point in the code? Well, that means that that we clicked on a button we care about, right? We clicked on a data-toggle button. So we can go ahead and prevent the default click, e.prevent default like so. And then we will do toggle stuff here, right? We're not going to do that just yet. I'm going to come back to that. But this is where we're going to do, just like we had our switch code that kind of toggle classes and did all that stuff. We're going to do our toggle stuff here, and then eventually we're going to fire the onToggle event, and then that will be this.config.onToggle, and then we will pass some data to it, right? So it's going to have like button and is toggled or whatever. We'll come back and add that later, but we will fire off that onToggle event that we captured in our options up here. So we'll kind of come back to that and make that work in just a moment. So I think as long as we did this right, we very quickly created a sort of the scaffolding, if you will, for our toggle component class. And now in our app.js, we can import toggle from toggle. And then we can say toggle buttons, const toggle buttons equals new toggle, like so. So we're going to instantiate an instance of the toggle class that we just created. And then what we have to do to actually test this and see that it works is we're going to have to add the data-toggle attribute, which is what it's set up to be configured as its attribute by default, to some HTML element that we actually want to attach this toggle interaction to. And that means if we just scroll down here, you'll notice this area where we actually have the plus and then the three buttons after it. In the HTML, the way it's set up is you basically have this button right here that has the plus in it. So there's our plus button. And then you have a div that's a sibling of that button just after. And that div has a class of reactions. So what we can do is, first of all, we can add data-toggle equals some value to this plus button. And we'll do the same thing down here for this one. And then if we just come in here, and maybe for now, if we just console.log toggling, we save that. Now, hopefully, you'll see in the console, if I click on the plus, we get that fired off. So we have successfully wired up our data toggle attribute to this class over here. And now the task is we actually need to make it work, right? We need to do something with this and figure out how we're actually going to make this toggle functionality function on this particular web interaction that we're building. So there's a lot of different ways to do this, and I'm going to start with showing you a couple of them, and then we'll kind of settle on one. But basically, the biggest thing that you have to wrestle with when you're dealing with a pattern that includes a trigger and a target element, like we have in this case. So we have the trigger, which is this button, This is the actual toggle button itself, and we'll call that the trigger. And then you have a target element, which is this div with a class of reactions. And in this case, what we want to do is we kind of want to be able to click on this button, and then this div right here will either have display none or it'll have display block. Like we want it to show and hide, just like that. And generally the way you would want to do that is you would somehow in your HTML have to have sort of a query selector or a reference to this element down here. And an easy way to do that, and probably the first thing you would generally reach for, is you could do something like where you have a unique ID on this target element down here. And so the target element could have an ID of, for example, story1-reactions. And up here, this data toggle could contain a there's really not a wrong answer here. It's totally up to you how you want to do it, but you could do something like data toggle, the value of that attribute will always contain the ID of the element that it controls, or the target element that it is being triggered on. Or maybe you can say that's a query selector, right? In which case I could use the number sign in a story of reactions. And that might make it a little more flexible, because if for some reason I wanted to use like dot or something like that, I would have the ability to do that here. So it's totally up to you how you want to do this. There's not really a right or wrong way, but I'll show you a couple ways, like I said, and you can pick which one works best for you in your scenario. But so let's start with this one first. We'll basically say, okay, the data-toggle attribute will contain a query selector that's going to point us to the target element. So the target element has an ID of story1 reactions, and the data toggle has an attribute value of number sign story1 reactions, which is a query selector that will resolve at this element down here. And then that means we have to have a different unique ID down here on the second story. So this will be story2 reactions, like so. And then this attribute value will obviously have to be story2-reactions. So with those updates in place, I can now, in our toggle class that we have created, instead of console logging, I could do const target equals document.query selector, and then we could get the attribute value, which again contains the query selector. So I could say, oh, and you know what? I need to get the button first because the attribute value is on the button. So we'll say get the button. And const button is going to equal e.target.closest. And then this is the same thing we did with our switch button. So we're going to use that closest traversal method to get the closest thing that contains this.config.attr. So that will allow us to get the button. And then down here, when we're getting the target, we can say document.querySelector button.getAttribute this.config.attr. So that's going to get the attribute value of, by default, data-toggle. So once we've done that, let's just for now console.log target to make sure that when we click on the trigger, we get the correct target element. And you'll see when I click on plus, we get story1 reactions. So there's that first one. So it's pointing to the correct target. And then if I click on this one, we actually get story2 reactions. So this is one method for us to be able to get a target element. And we should probably even change this to get the target element, or get the toggle target, whatever you want to call that. And this method isn't entirely bulletproof, right? Because it kind of requires that you pretty much have a unique ID on the target element, which might not always be ideal. I know in some cases you may not have complete control over the HTML, or you may not want to create these unique IDs with these numbers in them because it looks kind of messy or whatever. But you could potentially have issues with this. Like if I were to just use this reactions class and we were to just put .reactions, and maybe we didn't want to have a unique ID for each one of these, that's going to be an issue, right? Because we're using document.querySelector reactions you'll see what happens now is when we use that method, when I click on plus, we have this, as I hover over it, you'll see it's highlighting that first one right there, and that works fine. But if we go to the second one, it's still going to be referencing the first set of reactions. Because again, document.querySelector is only going to return the first matching element that it finds. So it's going to return the first thing that matches .reactions, which is always going to be this first thing. So you may find yourself reaching for things like inside of your toggle method here. Instead of using document.querySelector, you could use something like button.parentElement.querySelector. So you could go to the button's parent. If you know that the target is always going to be a sibling, you could go to the button's parent and then run a query selector on it. And again, this is that whole traversal thing that I mentioned. And it's very important to get a handle on this and how to do it, because this is how you find your target. And that's really important in a lot of web interactions. You need to be able to traverse from a trigger button or from a button that actually fires off this interaction to some sort of target. It's a very, very common pattern you're going to find in a lot of web interactions. So you kind of have to get comfortable with this idea of using all these traversal methods. And that means using the relationships between your HTML elements to traverse the DOM, the document object model. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm going to the button's parent, which is a story, and then I'm only going to search the story for .reactions. What you see here, as you highlight the story, you'll notice on the left, it's only going to search that highlighted area, which means that it kind of scopes it to each story, which might be a better use case in this specific example. And you'll notice, as long as I need to save this, let's save that. When we click, let's clear the console down here. When I click on plus, I'm going to get a reference to the first .reactions. And when I click on plus down here, I get a reference to the second one. So that kind of fixes the issue because we're essentially scoping our query selector to a smaller set of content, which is going to work better. You could even do something like, in this case, instead of using the parent element, I could say button.nextElementSibling. Right? We could not even use a selector if you want. That's another method. And then you'll see here, even without using the selector, if I click on plus, I get that one. If I click on plus down here, I get that one. I don't tend to like this approach. I think that your traversal should not totally rely on a certain HTML structure, because the problem with this is that if somebody comes in after the fact and decides, you know what, after each one of these buttons, I want to put a div class equals, I don't know, something, and then hello or whatever. I'm just messing around right now, but basically I put in like this hello thing. And just by a simple HTML change, we basically just broke our toggle, right? Because now when I click on plus, because it's the next element sibling, this div that I just added to my HTML now becomes a target, and I'm suddenly, this feature is going to break because it was so reliant on a very specific HTML structure. So let's undo that. I don't want to do that. What I find is going to work in the largest array of scenarios is, and I use this on pretty much all like drop downs, and it's actually the same thing they do in a lot of other front end frameworks, is basically what you do is you have some sort of container element that all of your functionality for this one interaction is going to be scoped to. And what I mean by that is, for example, with each of these buttons, let's go to the beginning of the button, and I'm going to do two cursors, and we'll do div class equals toggle. And so we'll put a div with a class of toggle around this, and we'll paste that in. So each one of these now has kind of a container that it's in, a toggle container, if you will. And the container contains all the things that our interaction cares about. So everything that has to do with a toggle is going to occur inside of this toggle container. And it essentially is just scoping this interaction so it never has to break out of this container. All the stuff it cares about is right here. And again, there's lots of different ways for you to do this. You can do it however you want. You can pick the version that works for your particular scenario. But what I really like about this is basically what we can do now that we've set this up is in our toggle here, let's add a new option to our config up here at the top. And what this is going to be called, it's going to be called toggle container, and this will be a selector for the container itself. So by default, and this is configurable in each instance, that we instantiated this class, so somebody can configure that if they want. But by default, we're going to have a toggle container that's going to match this selector .toggle. And then by adding this as an option to our components configuration, we can now come down here, and anytime we need to traverse anything for this interaction, we can basically go up, find the toggle container, and then just search that for whatever we want. We're just kind of scoping all of the traversal to this smaller set of HTML elements. And this is actually going to help with performance as well, because instead of searching the whole document for matching things, you're searching a smaller subset of the DOM, which is going to make it a bit faster as you're running this, especially when you have a whole bunch of these running on the page. So what this is going to look like is it's going to be, the target's going to be button.closest, this.config.toggle container. So it's going to search for the closest thing that matches that toggle container, which will go up to that container. And then we're going to run the query selector on that, which is going to run and check for the first thing that matches button.get attribute this.config.attr. So kind of the same thing we did to start with, where we're using an attribute selector that we're getting off of that data-toggle attribute value, but we're running the query selector again only within the scope of the toggle container. And hopefully you will see here, now we go over here and it's going to be working once again. So the first one is going to select the first reactions div. The second one is going to select the second reactions div as its target. And what's cool about this pattern is in the HTML, if I come in and I put a span around this button, this is the story 2 button right here, you'll see I just changed the HTML structure of how our reactions sort of component is, but it's still going to work, right? Because it didn't care that the HTML changed. It only cared that the target thing it's looking for is inside of a container. And similarly, I could come in and change the HTML of this thing. So maybe I can put a span around the target. And again, this second button is still going to work because we're searching this whole parent toggle container for the target element in this case. So I like that approach because it tends to be a little more resistant to HTML changes, which I think is important. You always want to make these something that are going to work in the largest amount of scenarios possible. And you certainly want to allow the most HTML flexibility that you can. And hopefully this pattern will allow us to do that in a large array of scenarios. And finally, what we want to do here is rather than just logging out that, now that we have a toggle target that exists within the toggle container, let's toggle the target. Toggle the target. And what we'll do is simply, just like we did with our button when we were creating a switch before, this time we'll do target.classlist.toggle, and let's toggle an active class. But I actually want to make that configurable, so let's cut that and we'll come up here to our options and we'll just say toggle class is equal to active by default. And then instead of hard coding that in our toggle method, now we can go back down and we'll toggle this.config.toggle class. Like so. And now you'll finally notice that if you watch in the HTML view of our dev tools over here, you see there div class equals reactions. When I click on the plus, it's going to add active. When I click on it again, it's going to take it away. And then the only thing left to do is in our SAS file, we can come down to the very bottom of this file, and you notice we already have a selector for .reactions here. I could simply add not active display none. So when the reactions div does not have a class of active, then we're going to add display none. And you notice here, gotta save. And then now they're going to disappear, but when I click on the plus, they appear. When I click on the plus again, they disappear. And it's going to work independently for each one of those components. And the last thing I want to do before we wrap this up is just make sure that our onToggle event is going to work as well. So now that we have some actual variables and stuff that we need, we can log the button. And then the second thing we had here was is toggled. We can actually create a variable for that. Is toggled, const is toggled. is equal to target.classList.contains this.config.toggleClass. And then we'll pass that to our custom on toggle event down here. And it's probably a good idea to pass the target as well. So we'll pass both the button, the target, and is toggled. And let me just make sure our signature target is updated up here at the top. Button target is toggled. And now we can test this by, in our configuration, when we're instantiating this, we can say on toggle. It's going to accept button target is toggled. And then we could do something like if, or you know what, I'll tell you what we'll do is we'll just set button.textContent is equal to, and we'll do a ternary operator for when it's toggled. Then we will add I need to search my emojis here, a minus emoji. And then otherwise we'll go back to the plus emoji, which is right there. And so that will allow us to kind of have, you can see this custom functionality where we switch between a plus and a minus on toggle. And as you can see, our custom lifecycle on toggled event is working just fine for this component that we have built. Great, so this is working very well at this point. In the next lesson, we're going to start to improve this even further. And we can, now that we have a basic toggle interaction down, we can actually use this for a whole bunch of cool stuff in our web applications that we build. So we'll look at that in just a moment when you stay tuned in our next lesson.